This video is brought to you by the complete Waifu Handbook and its wonderful Discord, but more about that later. I'm going to open this one up by quoting a fellow devil. Vanity is definitely my favorite sin. Kevin, it's so basic. Self-love, the all-natural opiate. Comics have always been political, has become the post-2016 rallying cry for current year Marvel defenders. An effort to push back against the horde of Marvel's angry legacy fanbase now taking issue with the company's new direction. The word angry, of course, has been dirtied by the internet so much that its meaning is currently closer to unreasonable rage. An effort to paint all critics as unreasonable and therefore dismissible. This way, the Marvel writers seem both victim and hero, by writing their stories with the stunning and brave commentary despite the outrage. But what caused the anger in the first place? As you could probably guess, the major source of the conflict is the surge of politically driven stories modern comics have blatantly produced. And "Stop Making Comics Political" has become the rallying cry for the disgruntled fans, which of course led to the phrase "comics have always been political." The supposed reason why so much of Marvel's legacy fanbase has either walked away or have erupted into full revolt is because it's no longer their politics or their self-image being reflected in these books, and that they feel threatened by the lack of reflection. To quote Kelly Sue DeConnick, when some of the more reactionary comic book fans, as my academic friends like to call them, a normative comic book reader, which is, by the way, such a myth. My point being that some of the men with short memories who are so threatened by myself and my female colleagues, and some of the books that we make that bring different perspectives, who feel that we are taking something away from them. The quote is a bit messy because in this interview, DeConnick is obviously angry and makes more complaints than points, but we're still shown some critical things, like Kelly Sue DeConnick's different perspective being a political one.
And if you don't like my politics, don't buy my book. Problem solved.
To again quote Kelly Sue DeConnick, "I'm sorry to break this to you, but Captain America is a social justice warrior. And the truth is, there actually is a legacy of American comics reflecting politics, even Marvel and DC. Magneto's infamous tragic backstory as a Holocaust survivor immediately comes to mind. Even Frank Miller, who, if you're a member of the performatively offended group of Americans, is the guy who wrote Holy Terror. But if you're everyone else, he also penned the legendary Batman saga The Dark Knight Returns, and an original series called Sin City. And Miller had this to say on the topic. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a political perspective in life if you're awake. But also, when I started the very first Dark Knight, it just struck me as odd that comics were so divorced from everything in the real world. And that here we have all this cartooning talent and we're not using it to do what cartoonists are most known for, which is political cartoons. So to me, it was just a natural marriage. And it also gave the series a Greek chorus. That is, a way for the rest of the world to react to Batman being out there. True to Miller's philosophy, The Dark Knight Returns was saturated with political and social commentary. This is also why Superman became an iconic symbol of excellence, to be used as propaganda against America's enemies. And Marvel's very own Stan Lee once said, "Marvel has always been and always will be a reflection of the world right outside our window." Meaning, real-world social issues and politics are fair game for superhero conflicts. This is Captain America punching Hitler, the Punisher fighting the IRA, and most importantly, the X-Men combating prejudice. X-Men in particular have become the go-to example when proving that comics have always been political. As the legend goes, the great Stan Lee secretly forged the X-Men in the fires of Mount Marvel, and that Lee intended it to be the most hard-hitting political commentary ever by making the main characters mutants in place of minorities, and by modeling the two mutant leaders after Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcom X, he was able to force the conversation of bigotry onto all those who read it. So the legend goes, because modern writers like Kelly Sue DeConnick and her friends need Stan Lee to have been an iconic activist writer, because they want to become iconic activist writers. They need Stan Lee to be the great progressive hero who defied the mean old bigoted conservatives and bravely wrote a story of anti-bigotry under the veil of the superhero genre, forcing a political conversation on his readers and spreading awareness throughout the country. And the current year Marvel defenders will repeat the legend this way because they too want to force conversations and craft political narratives rather than interesting ones. But here's the thing, if Marvel Comics has always been political, and more to the point, if Stan Lee had always steered the company in a progressive direction, then what makes today any different? Remember DeConnick's words, "I'm sorry to break this to you, but Captain America is a social justice warrior." Remember, Captain America's first appearance was in 1940, and if DeConnick is claiming that Captain America has always championed progressive politics and that Marvel heroes were social justice warriors over 80 years ago, then what changed? After all, if the legend of Stan Lee's X-Men holds true, and it truly was a blatant parallel to the civil rights movement, then Marvel Comics have always reflected DeConnick's politics, haven't they? After all, Stan Lee's Marvel has always been political and always been progressive, right? So on one hand, legacy Marvel fans have no reason to be angry by the direction DeConnick and her friends have taken Marvel because these comics have always been political, to quote.
Exactly. Right? This is always when people are like, would you please get your politics out of my comic books? I'm like, what comic books are you reading? Where is the apolitical comic book that you're reading? Like, I want to go back to the comic books we were reading in my youth. The 70s, when they were incredibly political.
Combine that with their view on Captain America, and it seems Marvel has not only always been political, but progressively political. From the nerdy Spider-Man to the godly Thor to the blind Daredevil to the gritty Luke Cage, who actually was the star of a 70s era comic and began his story jailed for a crime he didn't commit. And of course, the X-Men, exploring a variety of perspectives from a variety of different people, all while emphasizing good morals and a push for justice. Yet, on the other hand, Marvel apparently catered to only one specific group of readers who were all bigots and who are now furious that Marvel has taken a sudden dramatic shift towards progressive politics. To quote,
some of the men with short memories who are so threatened by myself and my female colleagues and some of the books that we make that bring different perspectives, who feel that we are taking something away from them. Like, I have no interest in taking your books. You continue to make, we continue to make all of the books. You can have the books that you want, but I'd like there to be some others too.
In short, angry Marvel fans are hypocrites because Marvel has always been progressively political, but also these fans are just angry because Marvel has now chosen to bring in new perspectives and become progressively political. Got it? I hope so, because if you don't, you're a bigot Nazi bigot. I mean, you'd be right that it doesn't make any sense, but they'll still call you a bigot Nazi bigot. Sometimes Marvel has always been politically progressive. Sometimes Marvel has only ever catered to conservative white men. Sometimes Marvel has always done both at the same time. You must try harder, Winston. It's not easy to become sane. Obviously, there is a big difference between older Stan Lee Marvel and new corporate-approved Marvel sanitized for a modern audience. And it isn't politics, but political bias. Political bias driven by massive, unchecked egos. How do we know? Because the legend isn't true. The truth about Stan Lee's X-Men is that it was never meant as some grand social commentary set to change the world. The legend was retold that way after the fact, and was embraced by modern Marvel because it painted Stan Lee as a like-minded creator, and therefore justified their own actions as they desecrate our beloved heroes and turned their world into a progressive fantasy land built on oppression porn. They rewrote Stan Lee's legacy from a guy who aimed to sell comics and into that of a political activist, and they did it all for the sake of vanity. I mentioned before that the outrage was caused by political bias and the writer's ego, and it very much was. But I assert that the event sparking the blowback was the desecration of our heroes. When DeConnick said, "I have no interest in taking your books, you continue to have all of the books, you can have all of the books that you want, but I'd like there to be others too," her words seem reasonable. After all, DeConnick also wrote an original work called Bitch Planet, which was packed with DeConnick's politics. The story revolves around women who are arrested for being non-compliant, basically a feminist oppression porn power fantasy. As CBR's Caitlin Chappelle said, it focuses on real-world systems that oppress LGBTQ women, women of color, and women who don't conform to society. The main protagonists refuse to accept a system which sees their sexualities, bodies, race, and genders as a threat to society. If you didn't know what a social justice story was about, this is pretty much it. In principle, it claims to uplift and empower historically marginalized groups. And under the social justice umbrella, this ranges from women to racial minorities, people without voices now given voice. However, in practice, social justice stories are little more than oppression porn disguised as social commentary. Noble oppressed minorities rising up against the cartoonishly bigoted villains trying to hold them down. Like a Barbie's Dreamhouse version of the 90s. When the pizza guy arrives to a hot and ready harlot, what proceeds is not a reflection of real life, but an exaggerated version of real life, giving you a thin veneer of story and lots of terrible acting to focus on an adult-oriented fantasy. Social justice oppression porn runs on similar rules, giving you a thin veneer of story and lots of terrible writing to focus on an oppression-oriented fantasy, especially a big-budget strawman comic slapped with the Marvel label. While DeConnick's original work does just that, it wasn't the core of the fandom uprising. No one seems to mind that much how politically biased a writer gets in their own work, as long as it's uniform throughout and doesn't change halfway through. It was when DeConnick and her friends began turning beloved Marvel heroes into angry, hateful activists and changed their stories from heroic battles for justice into blatant oppression porn that legacy Marvel fans became infuriated with current Marvel trends. DeConnick, after all, is noted for recreating Captain Marvel into an ultra-feminist power fantasy. In fact, it's her version that allegedly inspired the 2019 Captain Marvel film, the one where they turned Nick Fury into a sidekick and filmed a scene where Carol Danvers felt entitled to break a man's bones and steal his things because he told her to smile. According to Salon, DeConnick is a proud feminist who doesn't shy away from her politics or putting that political bias in her work, and once again, we'll see the same contradiction we saw earlier. To quote, breaking it down a little bit more, I think in the timing, I had just come off of a bit of a backlash against the Captain Marvel relaunch and redesign, where it's one of those things where most everyone was enthusiastically supportive. But because I'm a crazy person, by which I mean because I am entirely normal, the only ones that really stuck in my head were the people who were saying, she's taken our character and inserted her feminist agenda. A little baffling to hear Captain Marvel fans complaining about overt feminism in Captain Marvel when DeConnick mentioned this. Carol Danvers in 1977 was an overtly feminist heroine. I was 7 years old. I had nothing to do with it, you know? So to summarize, Marvel's legacy fanbase is revolting over DeConnick's feminist agenda being forced onto Carol Danvers, despite Carol Danvers having always been overtly feminist. Apparently, like a fan suddenly realizing that Captain America was pro-America. Either longtime Marvel fans missed something so blatantly obvious for decades, or DeConnick did something blatantly different than simply continuing the feminist legacy of Carol Danvers, almost as if DeConnick is rewriting history to justify her actions. Now, doesn't that seem familiar? The contradiction hints that despite DeConnick's reasonable rhetoric, in practice, we get something entirely different and it becomes blatantly clear that she and her friends very much desire to take something away from fans. DeConnick highlighted the goal of social justice being to uplift the voices of the unheard, and this is true. It's so true, in fact, that Marvel went on to create Marvel Voices, which was intended to highlight creators of everyone's favorite categories of oppressed minorities, which gave us this little story. The She-Hulk story, Punishment, opens with the bad guy going to jail. Normally, that opening would make this tale a very short story indeed, but we're dealing with woke Marvel at its strongest here, so the man going to prison for 18 months on an assault charge isn't good enough. She-Hulk heroically destroys the truck, nearly killing the guard, just so the victim could get revenge. Keep in mind, the bad guy has already been judged and punished, so the plot takes us away from superheroics and more towards vengeance. In other words, there's no save the cat moment. In stories like this, we need to see the bad guy committing evil so the good guys are justified. We don't see the bad guy assault the victim, and the victim doesn't even look injured. In short, without seeing the nature and severity of the man's crime, or even if the crime happened, She-Hulk's actions seem downright malicious and not at all heroic. So many things nowadays are putting politics first, in not just comics or movies, but also your role-playing table. Wouldn't it be better if we returned to a better time where the party formed out of love instead of politics? A love for adventure, a love of unity, and of course, a love for waifus. The complete Waifu Handbook made by Stu of the Loading Crew is one monster of a sourcebook over 300 pages long, with 8 anime-inspired races, over a dozen new classes, hundreds of feats, spells, magical items, and of course, an entire roster of dateable waifus. Each chapter is packed with friendship, teamwork, and good old-fashioned anime shenanigans. Try the enigmatic Shinrujin race, which is basically the divine dragon race from Fire Emblem, but this one has an exclusive feat tree, prestige class, and archetype to fully unlock your ancient draconic power. Or maybe the new Battle Bride class, a combination of bard and fighter that fights in a battle dress and whose armor scales up your charisma as you lead your troops into battle. However, I think the real meat and potatoes of the book are the 50 new pages of cooking, camping, and legendary meals to bring a bit more camaraderie to your games. Right now, the book is nearly complete, but you can get full access to exclusive playtest material by following my link in the description below and into their Discord server. The first 1,000 people to join their Discord server will get a free 10% off coupon upon its final release. And if that's not all, the complete Waifu Handbook is not only compatible with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, it also works with Pathfinder 2nd edition and Pathfinder 1st edition for all you old school gamers out there. So, if you want a fun, politics-free TTRPG that prioritizes your fun over political correctness, go join the complete Waifu Handbook Discord server and check out that exclusive playtest material today. It supports other indies, it supports the channel, and best of all, it'll make Reddit incredibly angry. Anyway. Again, the practice by which social justice stories uplift voices is by degrading the people the writer doesn't like. What makes this mentality in its stories so toxic is its reliance on equity. In short, social justice stories in practice uplift historically marginalized voices as repayment for their past neglect, by belittling, demonizing, and degrading the groups who allegedly did the marginalizing. Social justice isn't about heroism, it's about abusing their power to rage against the groups of people they hate. This is how you get Lady Thor punching a villain extra hard because he doesn't like feminism. This is how you get that She-Hulk scene where she's yelling at Bruce, claiming that she has it a lot harder than him simply because she's a woman. This is why you get Riri Williams practically begging her teacher to be oppressed so she can rise up against it. The real disturbing factor is that this highlights the fact that social justice is not about justice at all. Social justice superheroes don't choose the path of the hero because they're driven by a strong sense of justice. They want someone to spite, to get revenge against. Social justice heroes have surprisingly villainous motivations. This is how you get Jackie McGee in Immortal Hulk number 11 complaining about living in a world of white, educated men like Bruce Banner, who rage and smash things. White men being the main category of people most despised by social justice. McGee wants to be like the Hulk, but of course it isn't because she wants to fight injustice, it's because raging white men get catered to in her eyes, and she also wants the ability to rage and smash things without repercussions. Very heroic. I think I'll come back to this one later. This is also how you get the laughably silly scene where a supervillainess surrenders to Lady Thor because she's a woman, and women need to stick together since they're part of the same category. Both women fighting against a society supposedly made for men. It really does feel like an annoying little sister from a Disney movie or something playing with her brother's toys. Captain America is stupid. He might be the first Avenger, but Captain Marvel's pilot name is Avenger, and Nick Fury named the entire Avengers team after her because she's cool and not a dumb boy. Ha ha. Or something like that. Social justice is less about the responsibilities of heroism and more about power. Marvel's push into politically heavy storytelling is not only real, but proudly done. Despite DeConnick's efforts to paint the rebelling fans as man-babies and bigots, there's a justifiable reason why they become so disheartened with the Marvel brand. So many mainstream creators see themselves as the next Alan Moore, a supposed political guru who changes the landscape with their hard-hitting stories supposedly filled with current year's social commentary. In their view, reflecting the world outside your window. There's a reason why Salon called Bitch Planet a raw, pulpy, dystopian parable. These mainstream creators see political lecturing as an essential element of brilliant writing. And of course, so many become so desperate to be seen as brilliant, they skew away from brilliance and toward disturbing levels of immaturity. We've gone from Neil Gaiman's Sandman guiding us on an interesting exploration into the nature of immortality to, I took that one guy I hate, I made him a villain in my comic. Now where's my Eisner? But wait, wasn't it true that Stan Lee held the same views? Didn't he make the XMen a political allegory of the civil rights movement to combat oppression? What's really so different about social justice stories from the normal superhero stories written by Stan Lee's Marvel? Is there a difference? Well, there are several issues, but I think the main one can be boiled down to one word: dishonesty. Remember when I noted it seemed like DeConnick was rewriting history to justify what she did to Carol Danvers? Notable author, fellow longtime social justice activist, and writer for both Captain America and Black Panther, Ta-Nehisi Coates once said, when you're writing any sort of fiction, you should be telling the truth as you see it. And I don't know how you do that without commenting on the broader society. You should be telling the truth as you see it rather than the truth. See, the truth as you see it isn't the truth at all. It's merely your perspective and not the full story. Being a good writer, or even a good artist in general, is about empathy. And as much as the word has been corrupted by Twitter activists, it remains true. A good artist must be willing to empathize with others, even if they're people he might disagree with or even despise. The world outside your window isn't simply the world as you see it, but the world as it actually is. Dishonest storytelling uses narrative elements in far more petty and biased ways. Taking one's limited perspective and writing it as the entire truth is dishonest. Like when Ta-Nehisi Coates not so subtly turned notable psychologist Jordan Peterson into Red Skull. This is why social justice writing and politically biased Marvel comics in particular have been called propaganda. Information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Though Jordan Peterson being compared to Red Skull made for some funny memes, Coates' perspective saw Jordan Peterson as a villainous manipulator leading young men to the far right. However, the reality is, Jordan Peterson is not a Nazi, but turning him into one affirms the artist's bias and personal hatred for Jordan Peterson, all to create Red Skull as an allegory for Jordan Peterson. Not the truth, but the truth as Coates saw it. Honest writing will paint a fictional character with real-life evil. Dishonest writing will paint a real-life person with fictional evil. But enough talking around the subject. Let's see social justice storytelling in action. Let's check in with Immortal Hulk, She-Hulk, and most importantly, the X-Men Green arc. Many fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe have taken issue with an infamous scene from the She-Hulk show, the one where Bruce Banner tells Jennifer Walters / She-Hulk that she needs to work on controlling her emotions. And this is a great example of one of the most annoying tropes in social justice writing. To quote, "Well, here's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time. When I'm catcalled in the street, when incompetent men explain my own area of expertise to me, I do it pretty much every day, because if I don't, I will get called emotional or difficult or might just get literally murdered. So, I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you." Social justice, in general, paints women as oppressed and men as the evil oppressors. The presumption is that men have it easy in society. Men are just handed power. The world caters to their needs and they are forgiven for anything they do wrong. Meanwhile, the presumption is that society places a lot of pressure on women and punishes women if they ever step out of line. In fact, this attitude spawned DeConnick's original work, and in social justice stories, the narrative is written as if this presumption is true, which, of course, it isn't. Not the truth, just the truth as they see it. Most men aren't taken seriously either, not until they prove themselves. It's not enough to simply exist, even if you're technically qualified. You have to prove yourself. This is why Han Solo just laughed at an uppity Luke Skywalker in A New Hope when they first met. The MCU's Captain America exists in the same universe as She-Hulk, and even he was treated like a joke by the US military. The MCU's Captain America wasn't taken seriously until he rescued a crew of captured soldiers from behind enemy lines. So even in-universe, Walter's issues are rather petty, especially since her central complaint is that she isn't simply given respect. In fact, the entire hero's journey is about proving oneself and earning respect, a rite of passage that our main character must go through to grow as a person and to prove themselves in the eyes of the world. To quote Joseph Campbell, the so-called rites of passage, which occupy such a prominent place in the life of a primitive society, ceremonials of birthing, naming, puberty, marriage, burial, etc., are distinguished by formal and usually very severe exercise of severance where the mind is radically cut away from the attitudes, attachments, and life patterns of the stage being left behind. This is how it should have been with Jennifer Walters, someone who begins arrogant, is humbled by the mentor, so she can mature from the person she was before. This is Luke Skywalker, this is Neo, but perhaps the most pressing example is none other than Bruce Banner himself, the very person she's yelling at. "In case you needed to kill me, but you can't. I know, I tried, I got low, I didn't see any end, so I put a bullet in my mouth, and the other guy spit it out. So I moved on. I focused on helping other people. I was good until you dragged me back into this freak show and put everyone here at risk. You want to know my secret, Agent Romanov? You want to know how I stay calm?" Banner's life as the Hulk was an endless nightmare. But in the Avengers movie, Banner proved himself a powerful force, not just as the Hulk, but as the man who had conquered the Hulk. Yet even Banner saw himself as a monster. He lived isolated, in constant misery for years until he discovered the secret to conquering his demons. Not avoiding his rage, but mastering it. Through trial, error, and intense emotional control, Banner was able to tame his temper. "That's my secret, Captain. I'm always angry." By the Avengers movie, Banner had taken a huge step in controlling the Hulk. By the time he's training Walters, he's completely mastered his wrath, and no longer needs to maintain a state of constant rage. This is how Banner tells Walters to control her anger, because controlling that anger is how he managed to find his way out of that endless misery. As much as the writers wanted to do a women have it worse story, Walters doesn't even have it nearly as bad as Banner did. Their constant need to show women as victims, while also strong and independent, end up making Walters seem arrogant and petty, rather than strong or brave. And this is why social justice writing can be annoying, pretentious, naive, and completely brainless, but also severely damaging to the story. According to social justice, society hates women and loves men. In fact, men are supposedly so privileged that they don't notice how hard women supposedly have it. This is why they gave Walters that speech. A social justice story will rarely, if ever, allow a man's problems to be treated as more dire than a woman's problems. Men's problems are deemed meaningless issues women roll their eyes at and reluctantly cater to. In other words, men are basically just spoiled toddlers in the eyes of social justice, selfish, overly emotional, and who think getting the wrong juice box is the worst problem in the world. Meanwhile, women have all the real problems. The exchange between Bruce Banner and Jennifer Walters is built on that exact social justice mentality. Jennifer delivers her speech like she's dropping a truth bomb on Banner, as if the writers were imagining the jaws of every man falling open as they watch the scene, now newly awakened to the suffering they've neglected for so long. And so Jennifer Walters tells Banner off, which is laughable in context. And then nothing happens. It's been pointed out by viewers, likely through eyes tearful with glee and ribs sore from laughter, that these complaints are nothing compared to what Banner has gone through. So Walters is wrong here, but she's written as correct. And yes, I know the defense, that she's actually wrong here because she involuntarily changes into She-Hulk, proving that she doesn't have control over her powers. However, the reason this doesn't count narratively is because there are no actual consequences for that emotional lapse. No pain, no damage, not even embarrassment. No consequences at all. Walters doesn't even know she changed. Ultimately, the change is just treated as a silly joke. Here's how the scene might have gone without the filth of social justice. Walters can deliver her speech as usual, but instead of walking away, she gets humbled. Have Bruce Banner actually step into the role of mentor by pointing out how petty her concerns are. Especially now. So what if she gets catcalled or some guy doesn't take her seriously? She's dealing with far higher stakes. Real anger, real consequences. Matters of life and death. Banner should have barked back, telling her about his trials and challenges, his years of pain, his desperate attempt to end it all. Banner should have made it clear that her concerns are nothing compared to the reality she faces now. So, instead of a joke, we get a serious character moment. One where Walters is given a harsh reality check by Banner. But social justice stories aren't about character growth, and they aren't really about heroism either. Social justice isn't about justice at all. It's about having power, and being good is using that power to avenge yourself. Probably against the white man who was cartoonishly bigoted against you. On the surface, it seems similar to normal heroic stories championing classic justice, but it's really quite different. In short, social justice, and equity in particular, is just a socially acceptable term for revenge. The revenge of the supposedly oppressed against their perceived oppressors by category. Someone innocent is guilty simply because they share the same traits or background as someone actually guilty, even if that someone lived 100 years ago. The exact opposite of Captain America's justice. This is why Jackie McGee said what she said in Immortal Hulk. We live in a world of men. White, college-educated men, men like Bruce Banner, who just rant and scream and rage, smash things, and the world bends over backwards to understand that, to reward it. This panel sticks out to so many for the exact reasons we just discussed. McGee condemns all college-educated white men as world-destroying, tantrum-throwing, spoiled toddlers that the world caters to, even though her only example is Bruce Banner. But she's written as correct, since she isn't challenged on it, and the social justice mentality just assumes that white men are oppressive and privileged. Again, the reality of Banner's curse is dismissed because he's a white man. Social justice loves dismissing context and belittling problems, so their little self-insert characters seem like the real victims. The fans know that being the Hulk is a curse. The world doesn't bend over backwards to understand or reward rampaging white men. They try to understand Banner's condition because he's a scientific anomaly, and he isn't rewarded. As was stated 3 panels prior, the Hulk said he was shot into space as an attempt to get rid of him, as a punishment. And just like Banner and the bullet, it obviously didn't work. And how does McGee respond? By again dismissing his problems. Yeah, you were shot into space, instead of just shot. First of all, shot with what? If they could just shoot the Hulk dead, someone probably would have done so rather than shooting him into space. And what are the real problems McGee comes back with? Your anger. It's indulged, even respected. Mine is dismissed, if I'm lucky. In other words, who cares if being the Hulk was torture, and that the best Banner can hope for was watching his best friends either plan his death or his exile? Those are just dumb things men think are problems. Just like Walter's, Jackie McGee's real issues include having to earn respect rather than just having it given to her. And, of course, consequences. Walter's even viewed acting unprofessionally as oppression because there are consequences if she throws a tantrum, as if being a normal, mature adult is some Herculean labor unique to her. No wonder she isn't getting that respect she wants so much. McGee notes the Hulk's destructive power and, like Walter's, dismisses his experiences. And what comes next is an example of the most disturbing trend found in social justice comics. Jackie McGee is actually envious of the Hulk's power. So yeah, I guess I'm asking, how do I get a piece of that pie, Hulk? How do I get to be what you are? Social justice writers and their so-called heroes aren't interested in helping people. They're obsessed with power. And in a non-social justice story, a real superhero story, this is where the Hulk would fight back and tell Jackie McGee she's wrong about having such power. The Hulk, of all people, would tell her the importance of keeping your temper under control, not covet its strength. You know, a little of the old, with great power comes great responsibility. For Jackie to be written as in the wrong, we need a scene where someone opposes her. Like that time in Star Wars when Yoda told Luke to lift his X-Wing from the swamp using the Force. Luke tries, fails, and says it's impossible. And then Yoda proves Luke wrong by doing it. We see the story telling us that Luke's defeatist attitude is wrong, and he needed a change of mindset. If the story really wanted us to see McGee's Sith-like desire for power as wrong, then the Hulk should have opposed that desire. But no. Just like in She-Hulk, the Hulk just lets this nonsense pass. Discussion is not something social justice stories like. What they really want is validation. They want to scream their one-sided argument and then have the person they're yelling at lay down and surrender. And here the Hulk responds with, that's good. I like that. How you talk about anger. Like it's something that needs letting out. Like it's useful. Like it can get things done. You don't lock it away. Call it another name. Pretend it's not you. You're not ashamed of it. That's right. The Hulk literally praises this attitude. Control, power, and fear are pillars of social justice. So not only does the Hulk fail to teach McGee about power and responsibility, but Jackie McGee almost convinces him that the responsibility thing is stupid. This would be like Yoda seeing Luke give up after failing and instead of proving him wrong, admire his willingness to surrender or something. To summarize, social justice stories are little more than infantile revenge fantasies where the writers value power over heroism and covet self-validation rather than truthful discussion. It's almost comical, like an Adam West Batman story where the Joker takes over the American comic book industry and starts writing villains as the good guys. Except it's really happening, and the world, for some reason, bends over backwards to understand it, to reward it. This is why female Thor said what she said when punching a guy. That's for saying feminist like it's a four-letter word, creep, and also, you know, for robbing. The dialogue is cringe, but it reveals that the anger is about the villain insulting her feminist ideology, not the actual crime he committed or the people he endangered. This is why the Captain Marvel movie isn't really about Danvers saving anyone. It's really about saving herself and showing how all the men are just silly idiots women are forced to deal with. Pretty much the same exact attitude as the She-Hulk show. In social justice stories, the fight for justice is just for show. And nowhere are all the problems of social justice stories more blatantly on display than in the X-Men Green arc. This is the infamous story arc where Nature Girl murders a store clerk. Why does she do this? Because a turtle choked and died on a grocery bag with the store's name on it. So Nature Girl leaves Krakoa and goes on a terror spree to avenge the turtle. The whole story is neckbeard levels of silly, written with complete seriousness, like a Captain Planet episode directed by Zack Snyder. Remember, social justice stories are all about revenge, power, and abusing that power without consequences. So Nature Girl kills the clerk, unleashes a swarm of birds on the innocent police officers who arrive to stop her, outwits Wolverine on several occasions, kills a bunch of workers at the pipeline with bees, and blows up an oil refinery before she's finally captured. All to avenge a random turtle that decided to eat a bag. John Wick, this is not. So after Nature Girl is captured, it's time for her to finally get her punishment. And here is my favorite part. Remember how social justice writers hate truthful discussion and only seek validation. In X-Men Green Arc, Magneto asks Nature Girl for her defense, to which Nature Girl says, "You say kill no man. Do we not kill man with inaction?" In an actual superhero story, this is when good guy Magneto would give her a verbal smackdown, a speech from his many years of suffering and experience. Remember, Magneto is a Holocaust survivor, and now at least a somewhat redeemed villain. He, more than most, can explain the dangers of abusing one's power. What can happen when a person with unquestionable power believes themselves justified abusing that power when committing violence and murder? You know, a little, with great power comes great responsibility. But in the social justice world, how does one of the most infamous genius-level masterminds in Marvel history respond to Nature Girl's simple retort? By hanging his head in shame, of course. Just like with Banner, nothing to say. Some of the smartest men in the Marvel universe with so many experiences and years of wisdom, and they have nothing to say. See? Just a straw man comic with the Marvel label. But wait, it gets worse. Nature Girl might have been rightfully found guilty by Magneto and Xavier, but they're just dumb boys. Nature Girl is written as heroic. The story is constantly justifying her villainous actions. The store clerk was a jerk, so it's okay when he dies. The workers of the pipeline are murderous psychos who get paid extra for every protester they bludgeon to death. Remember how Ta-Nehisi Coates framed Jordan Peterson as Red Skull, removing the nuance and saying Peterson is just a Nazi? This is the exact same thing. There would be too much nuance and sympathy for these blue-collar workers if they were just portrayed realistically, as hardworking guys just trying to make a living for their families. That might lead to an actual discussion. But remember, social justice writing isn't about discussion, it's about validation. So the pipeline workers are not normal everyday people, but murdering psychos. Why? Because that justifies the author's anti-oil power fantasy. And if the dog choosing to side with Nature Girl isn't proof enough that the author is painting their little eco-terrorist self-insert as the hero, then I don't know what is. Oh wait, how about the entire island of Krakoa siding with Nature Girl? When Magneto rightfully finds Nature Girl guilty, Krakoa forgives her and sets her free. And we're meant to feel relief when Nature Girl rejoins her friends and escapes so she can continue her murderous rampage for turtle vengeance. In summary, the X-Men Green Arc was blatant, biased propaganda for climate change that actively promoted a violent, tyrannical path over a heroic one. Because social justice stories are not heroic stories. Control, power, and fear are the pillars of social justice. So the stories are power-hungry revenge fantasies seeking to validate the author. It's the truth about modern comics that so many have noticed but are often unable to explain. It's the core issue that makes current year comics so different from old school comics. It's hard to pin down if you don't know what to look for, so we say the problem is politics rather than political bias. And each time you attempt to point out the issues, Marvel writers and their ardent defenders will always stand on the back of Stan Lee and prop up his name as a shield. But here's the more grounded difference between today's social justice era and the era of Stan Lee. Stan Lee's Marvel was in the business of making heroes, not victims. So then where do Stan Lee and the X-Men fit into all this? Surely they were products of social justice as well. I know we've gone over a lot so far, so let's summarize. In the words of Kelly Sue DeConnick, who is the very idea of the arrogant artsy student, comics have always been political. They've always been mirrors to the society they come from. There's a responsibility to address the issues of the day, which espouses the supposed responsibility of comic creators to reflect modern issues in their stories, which of course supports the continuation of promoting heavy-handed politics, even at the cost of the story, ruined by the oppression porn principle. In other words, pretentious, big-budget strawman comics. Their side is smart, witty, and cool, and the other side is stupid, gullible, and spineless. And to legitimize their perspective, they turn to celebrated comic book legends like Stan Lee, specifically to the portions of his comic literally labeled Stan Lee's Soapbox, where he would directly talk about his political and social views. Let's say it right on the line, bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. But unlike a team of costume supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the snoot or a zap from a ray gun. The only way to destroy them is to expose them, to reveal them for the insidious evils they really are. And so on. Now, enter the X-Men, a superhero series centering around the phenomena of human mutations leading to certain people having interesting abilities. Of course, the main issue, commonly brought up by the pro-political types, is the mutant struggle for acceptance. A major story element concerns the social majority fearing the mutant minority. And to complicate matters, there are two major mutant factions. Professor Xavier's faction, which focuses on earning acceptance by showing the world the good of mutant kind, and Magneto's faction, which tries to force acceptance through domination of humanity. Many equate this conflict to the American Civil Rights Movement, with Professor Xavier acting as parallel to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Magneto acting as parallel to Malcom X. And it's a fairly convincing argument, especially when Stan Lee said this during a Guardian interview back in 2000. It not only made them different, but it was a good metaphor for what was happening with the civil rights movement in the country at that time. It's quite clear here that the politics of Stan Lee's era possibly influenced story decisions. American journalist and author of the book Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, Sean Howe, hammered the point far more directly when he said, "There's a kind of undeniable set of allegories that are going on there. The X-Men was probably the most explicitly political of the 1960s Marvel comics, and to recall the words of Kelly Sue DeConnick, there's a responsibility to address the issues of the day, matching the world outside your window philosophy." Well, that's it then, isn't it? It's starting to seem as if my earlier theory was wrong. If the overall concern is the heavy-handed political messaging in modern comics and spreading awareness of the day's social issues, then it would appear that Stan Lee had the same intent. Or did he? Remember, the supposed civil rights allegory rests on how Xavier and Magneto are depicted, and the Stan Lee defense only works if Stan Lee's X-Men press the civil rights allegory as its major theme right from the first issue. Some of you might say that's a bit unfair. Right from the first issue, really? As with any proper story, the first issue does establish many of the iconic story elements and themes fans associate with X-Men today. Professor Xavier, his school for mutants, their conflict against Magneto, and yes, it even establishes the distrust of humans towards mutants. In fact, Jean Grey tells us that she had to conceal her power growing up, and Xavier himself said this: "When I was young, normal people feared me, distrusted me. I realized the human race is not ready to accept those with extra powers. So I decided to build a haven, a school for X-Men." And this is where a current year Marvel defender might say, "Gotcha, see? X-Men has always been a battle against oppression." Well, not exactly. The fear Xavier and Jean Grey experience were simple natural distrust normal people have when encountering someone they don't understand. And simple fear or distrust of mutants doesn't make it a civil rights allegory. After all, the civil rights movement wasn't simply against an idea, but an unjust institution built on unjust laws. Social justice activists paint a picture of Stan Lee's X-Men facing constant hate, fire, and brimstone from the world around them. But if that were the case, then wouldn't Professor Xavier's mission statement be to stand against this social injustice? After all, that is the story of the civil rights movement. It wasn't Martin Luther King Jr. fighting Malcolm X. It was both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X fighting an unjust system in their own way. Martin Luther King valued peaceful resistance in order to form a friendship and understanding rather than defeat his opponent. He wanted to fight the system, not the people. Comparing Stan Lee's Xavier to Martin Luther King Jr. makes it seem as if Xavier formed the X-Men as some kind of resistance movement against a cruel and hateful humanity. But here's the truth from Professor Xavier himself in the very first issue of the Uncanny X-Men penned by Stan the Man himself. "Jean, there are many mutants walking the earth, and more are born each year. Not all of them want to help mankind. Some hate the human race and wish to destroy it. Some feel that the mutants should be the real rulers of Earth. It is our job to protect mankind from those evil mutants." Remember, Marvel was in the business of making heroes, not victims. So Stan Lee's X-Men wasn't actually made to resist an overwhelming oppression. In fact, one could argue that mutants were possible oppressors of humanity, since so many saw fit to exploit their powers for evil. And Magneto, our supposed Malcom X, he was an icon of an evil mutant oppressor. He wasn't some noble yet misguided extremist fighting for an oppressed people. He was a mutant supremacist who believed his kind deserved to rule because they were the master race. To quote, "The human race no longer deserves dominion over the planet Earth. The day of the mutants is upon us. The first phase of my plan shall be to show my power, to make Homo sapiens bow to Homo superior." Magneto wasn't so much Malcolm X, but a mutant version of Hitler, which would later provide an interesting irony considering his backstory would reveal his status as a Holocaust survivor. But perhaps the clearest view of Stan Lee's Xavier and Magneto can be seen in issue 4 when they face off in a mental battle over the future of mankind. Magneto says to Xavier, "Only you and your mutants stand between us and world conquest. Why? Why do you fight us? For you too are a mutant." To which Xavier responds, "But I seek to save mankind, not destroy it. We must use our power to bring about a golden age on Earth, side by side with ordinary humans." Magneto responds by saying, "Never. The humans must be our slaves. They are not worthy to share dominion of Earth beside us. You have made your choice. Forevermore we are mortal foes." To which Xavier responds, "The X-Men will stop you, Magneto. It will be mutant against mutant, to the death if need be. But mankind must be saved. Stan Lee's vision for Xavier and Magneto was far from their supposed civil rights counterparts. While it's true King and Xavier both want peaceful coexistence, Xavier's goal was for relentless resistance against evil in all its forms, while Magneto desired nothing less than total domination for mutant kind. In contrast, Malcom X preached segregation, a separation from the rest of society, not conquest. And yes, prejudice against mutants did exist in the Stan Lee era, but that core element of that prejudice was not blind bigotry, but the evil mutants themselves. Even when some humans took steps against mutants, it was to oppose the very real threat of mutant domination, a threat only spawned by Magneto's own bigotry. Like the time a group of people in issue 8 tried to attack Beast after he just saved a kid, and what was the cause? Well, a lady in the crowd summarizes their reasoning fairly well. I've heard there are many such mutants in hiding, waiting to take over the world. Sounds outlandish on the surface, but then you remember that domination is Magneto's exact goal. So it isn't the people driven by baseless hatred. They fear mutants because, while not the intent of the X-Men, there is actually a group of mutants actively trying to take over the world. Evil acts done by evil mutants caused all mutants to suffer. But in Stan Lee's world, the world isn't blindly hateful like they would be in a social justice story. In other words, a story that fetishizes oppression. And the good deeds of the X-Men are also rewarded. For every angry mob, there's a mob of girls wanting to get with Angel, a military general who idolizes their deeds, or a group of blue-collar workers wanting to shake their hands. You remember blue-collar workers, right? The people social justice hates so much they made them raging psychos in the X-Men Green arc. In Stan Lee's world, they're exactly how I said they should be. Normal everymen making a living. It's natural for people to distrust something they don't understand. However, as you've seen, social justice activists demand nothing less than unconditional acceptance and praise. While Stan Lee knew there would be natural distrust and prejudice, as we've seen with X-Men's very first issue, it didn't focus on a battle against oppression, nor did it demonize one group or another like social justice enjoys doing. In other words, it wasn't mutants or humans or blue-collar workers. The X-Men fought against evil in all its forms. Stan Lee's X-Men were not hateful activists, but trained as champions of both mutant and humanity. So, to once again address the earlier question, what's the difference between social justice Marvel and Stan Lee's Marvel? Stan Lee's Marvel, as shown in his version of the X-Men, was in the business of creating heroes, not victims. And few other quotes better summarize his writing philosophy than, so social issues I try to get in the background, or an underlying plot, but never to the point of letting it interfere with the story or hitting the reader over the head. The legend of Stan Lee as the pioneer social justice activist, bravely writing strong political themes into his stories, spreading awareness and forcing conversations the country over with his X-Men oppression porn, was just that, a piece of internet myth that people thought sounded good. Stan Lee is often seen as a great progressive and is often the guy people point to when justifying putting their own biased politics into works. Well, Abraham Wiseman, author of True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee, had this to say. Left-leaning Marvel fans have often held Lee up as a hero for those who seek to fight inequality and bigotry, calling him a progressive genius and a true ally for people of color. Some point to the occasional moments when he would write short editorials vaguely decrying racism. Others offer interpretations of his heroes as underdogs who represent the downtrodden, particularly the X-Men. Lee couldn't be called right-wing, but his politics had a conservative bent. He often wrote and spoke about how reactionaries and radicals were equally wrong, and privately complained about how taxes in America were too high. But surely that couldn't be all. The myth had to come from somewhere, right? Don't worry, we're not done yet. Neil Gaiman once said, "Story fundamentally is conflict. It's about people with needs and wants and what happens when those needs and wants are frustrated." While Stan Lee's X-Men had many of the story elements we know the X-Men to have, it's not the version we're familiar with, but the writing mentality mentioned by Gaiman is what gave us the far more complex version of the X-Men we know today. Stan Lee helped make Marvel Comics the colossus it became by caring for the customer, connecting with the people, and creating stories with honest storytelling. He wanted to make characters the reader wanted to buy, and thrilling stories they wanted to read, not characters they should morally like or stories they should morally read. In other words, Stan Lee wasn't running Marvel like his own personal blog or some far-left propaganda arm. He helped run comics like a business. To quote, "I had already done Spider-Man, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, and my publisher said, 'Give me another book, Stan. We're going strong. Let's do some more.' Well, in order to get a new superhero, you have to think of what his or her power is. That's not too hard, but you have to figure out how they get that power. A I can't have them all be bitten by radioactive spiders. And then it hit me. What if they're mutants? What if they're born that way? As we've seen, Stan Lee didn't base Professor X after Martin Luther King, and Magneto definitely wasn't Malcolm X. These were parallels made much later and from stories penned by a different writer entirely. Chris Claremont arrived to reboot the X-Men in 1975, over a decade after it had first published in 1963, and it was Claremont who emphasized placing real-world issues into X-Men stories, including prejudice. The opening issue showed the mutant Nightcrawler running from a murderous mob who intended to kill him for his freakish appearance. Here some might say, ha, so politics did make the X-Men popular. Well, not exactly. Remember, conflict is the beating heart of story. It wasn't politics or social issues that made the X-Men the powerhouse it is today. It was the conflict they provided. And according to a 2011 CNN article covering an interview with Claremont, he seems to agree. The best moments in comics come from a primal image that captures the emotion and the conflict. What you add are the pieces that get you to the point of what happens next. Comics are primal, down, and dirty. Also note, Claremont didn't point to social issues, politics, or spreading awareness, but primal images that spark emotion in the reader and revolve around conflict. Until Claremont came around, the X-Men were more or less a normal superhero team. But if you notice, every character that lasted the test of time came with its own overarching conflict, beyond each individual adventure. Spider-Man learned that with great power comes great responsibility. He learned that being wronged or shunned doesn't give him the right to return hatred with hatred. Superman struggles with immeasurable power and fights to do the right thing when it's so easy for him to choose the wrong. And now, X-Men had their own conflict in the form of prejudice. According to Stan Lee, the X-Men are a group of mutants who, because they were born with an extra power that the average human being doesn't have, they are considered minorities. And I wanted to show that the only difference between them and other people is that they have an extra power, and that doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make them evil. And I wanted to point out that we shouldn't dislike or distrust people only because they're different. The fact is, Claremont's vision of the X-Men wasn't too far away from Stan Lee's vision. Under both writers, Xavier and Magneto both experienced fear and distrust from humans. Yet, each had conflicting philosophies. Xavier envisioned a golden age via peaceful coexistence, while Magneto envisioned a golden age through mutant domination. In the words of Stan Lee, taken from a 2010 CNN interview called How to Succeed in Comics, Why Stan is the Man, he had this to say. I thought, even though these were action stories for comic books, I thought it would be rather interesting to the readers to have a third dimension to the stories, which I've always tried to do in a subtle way. Inject a little bit of philosophy or a little bit of something to think about when the reader reads these stories. They were meant to emphasize the conflict between people who felt that we've all got to work together and find a way to get along, and people who feel we're not treated well, therefore we're going to strike back with force. To put it simply, Claremont took what Stan Lee wanted to do with X-Men and supercharged it. And there are few other areas where this mentality is reflected in his X-Men run than with his expansion of Magneto's character. You see, it was Claremont who decided in Uncanny X-Men number 150 to make the great human nemesis a Holocaust survivor. A move that made him more sympathetic to some and of course highlighted the overarching theme of prejudice. But the main reason this change was so intriguing was the internal conflict this revelation gave Magneto. Magneto was introduced as a man who wanted nothing less than complete domination of humanity by mutants because his kind were superior. Claremont took a true event, one of the most horrific events in modern history, and used those real-world horrors to give Magneto substantial internal conflict. And so there was an interesting irony when X-Men number 150 made Magneto a man so twisted by his past that he became the same monster he swore to fight against. Because Magneto didn't see an individual. He saw the Nazis' sins during World War II as a sin of all mankind. He categorically blamed humanity and saw them unfit as the dominant species of Earth. Going by what we've talked about, Magneto's attitude might be starting to sound a bit familiar, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Magneto's transformation is exactly what Stan Lee meant by writing the world outside your window. Magneto's suffering from the Holocaust and having him haunted by those atrocities gave his character complexity, and making Magneto so mentally scarred that he became the very evil he sought to destroy ironically made his character feel human. Claremont's decision changed Magneto from a mustache-twirling comic book villain into a three-dimensional character with his own goals, justifications, and flaws. To quote, "I swore then that I would not rest till I had created a world where my kind, mutants, could live free and safe and unafraid, where such as you, little one, could be happy. Instead, I have slain you." I remember my own childhood, the gas chambers at Auschwitz. The guards joked as they herded my family to their death, as our lives were nothing to them. So human lives became nothing to me. I believed so much in my destiny, in my own personal vision, that I was prepared to pay any price, make any sacrifice to achieve it. But I forgot the innocents who suffered in the process. Can you not appreciate the irony? In my zeal to remake the world, I have become much like those I've always hated and despised. This is all well and good, but what does Magneto's transformation have to do with the X-Men being political? Sure, there were politics within the pages of early X-Men, and prejudice was mentioned as a theme early on, and activists of social justice would have you believe all superheroes are social justice warriors, like when Kelly Sue DeConnick screeched about Captain America being one. They would have you believe Stan Lee's X-Men was a story about the oppressed fighting their oppressors from day one. But the truth tells a different story. Stan Lee's Marvel, and even the Marvel of Chris Claremont, were about heroes, not victims. Stan Lee's mission with the X-Men wasn't "you're being held down so get angry about it," or "get revenge on those who harmed you," like in social justice stories. His X-Men showed us that not only is it okay to be different, but that you shouldn't return hatred with hatred. And even after Claremont took over, the X-Men still maintained the idea that with great power comes great responsibility. For example, Magneto claimed mutants to be superior. As a response to Magneto's reign of terror, the villainous Bolivar Trask would categorically paint all mutants as humanity's greatest enemy, just as Magneto had painted all of humanity as categorically inferior. And so Bolivar Trask created the Sentinels to protect humanity from the mutant threat, only for those Sentinels to turn on the very man who created them. While activists will say Marvel has always pushed social justice, writing the truth as they see it, as we've seen, this is a lie. Because the truth is, Stan Lee's Marvel stayed true to a philosophy of universal truths. Most notably, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. To quote, "I don't like to preach. I hate people to preach to me, and I don't like to preach to other people. But at the same time, I feel there are kind of universal truths that nobody could quibble with. Like, to me, the most important mantra in the world is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I don't see how anybody could take issue with that, and I try to follow that. And I think if everybody followed it, the world would be paradise." Despite popular belief, Stan Lee wasn't about preaching his politics, and he wasn't about sanitizing reality to fit his ideology. He wanted to make heroes readers would find fun and kids would find inspiring, not social justice strawman comics. Whether he imagined a conflict or took inspiration from the real world, the enemy was evil, not raging white men or blue-collar workers, or any other category of people the smug, big-brain activists of today love demonizing. To once again quote Stan Lee, "I realize there are an awful lot of youngsters reading these stories, and if we had a character who smoked a cigarette or something, the kids would imitate that. So I tried to be very, very careful in what we did in these stories, so that the reader, particularly a young reader, would not get the wrong impression, and would maybe get some good, positive things from the stories." Stan Lee created X-Men not as a civil rights allegory, but to show the value of tolerance, and as we see with Magneto and Trask, the dangers of categorical hatred even for the ones doing the hating. And this remained the same even under the Claremont run. The 2020 era of American comics seemed to favor twisting the heroic philosophy that the Stan Lee era built. Heroic characters are seen as boring or products of a bygone age, so modern writers update them. They make heroic characters morally gray, evil, or naive. These writers scorn and look down upon them, while villains are given sympathy and understanding, sometimes even treated like anti-heroes, or as the X-Men Green arc showed us, murderous villains seeking angry vengeance upon the world are written as heroic and righteously justified. Power, anger, violence, and hatred are the universal virtues of social justice. So Claremont could have easily done the same. He could have walked the social justice writing path and used Magneto's tragic backstory to frame his anger as justified, give him his own Thanos was right story. However, Claremont didn't do that. He used Magneto's backstory not to justify him, but to better highlight his villainy. Stan Lee and Claremont both showed us that while there may be some understandable motivations behind these acts of villainy, there is no moral justification for evil to break or go against Stan Lee's universal truths. In other words, being sad or angry doesn't mean you're suddenly correct. And I know what response might come next. Okay, Okay, so Stan Lee may not have made X-Men a civil rights allegory, he didn't make Xavier a stand-in for Martin Luther King Jr., and he didn't make Magneto Malcom X. But clearly Claremont did, right? Well, let's see what Claremont said when asked about that very issue in a 2011 interview. It was too close. It had only been a few years since the assassinations. In a way, it seemed like that would be too raw. My resonance to Magneto and Xavier was born more out of the Holocaust. It was coming face to face with evil. And how do you respond to it? In Magneto's case, it was violence begets violence. In Xavier's, it was the constant attempt to find a better way. As we got distance from the 60s, the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Mandela resonance came into things. It just fit. Surprise, surprise. Claremont may have ramped up the social issues and real-world parallels, but his inspiration wasn't the civil rights movement. It was the hatred that led to the Holocaust. I know it's subtle, but making Magneto a Holocaust survivor might have been somewhat of a hint. And here Claremont is again in a 2024 Screen Rant article just plainly called Professor X and Magneto were not based on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. There's a lot of talk online now that Magneto stands in for Malcolm X and Xavier stands in for Martin Luther King. But for me, being an immigrant, white, to make that analogy felt incredibly presumptuous, Claremont states. An equivalent analogy could be made to Menachem Begin as Magneto, evolving through his life from a terrorist in 1947 to a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize 30 years later. Even all these years later, Claremont shows us how to properly use real-life inspirations and parallels. While Ta-Nehisi Coates was busy turning Jordan Peterson into a Nazi simply because he doesn't like him, Claremont modeled Magneto after Menachem Begin to give the villain a meaningful character arc. He acknowledged both the bad and the good as proper parallels, from villainous terrorist to someone working for a brighter future. As we've seen, a social justice story would likely call him a hero for being a terrorist, because he's terrorizing people social justice activists do not like, and therefore his anger makes him justified. So then, where does the myth come from? If you don't like my politics, truth as you see it, me. The current crop of narrative craftsmen are unapologetically driven by ego. Easily matches with what we've seen of the social justice mindset, doesn't it? The idea that they are correct and the rest of us are just unenlightened fools. Almost sounds like the perspective of a supervillain, complete with the obsessive vanity. As I went through multiple X-Men stories from both the Stan Lee era and the Claremont era, I never once had to worry about their personal politics. To once again quote Stan Lee, I thought even though these were action stories for comic books, I thought it would be rather interesting to the readers to have a third dimension to the stories, which I've always tried to do in a subtle way. Inject a little bit of philosophy or a little something to think about when the reader reads these stories. So ultimately, X-Men as a civil rights allegory was an internet myth as false as the popular Stan Lee defense, the one that claims that Stan Lee was some great pioneer political writer, just so the social justice activists of today can justify their own bias and hateful politically saturated stories. How do I know? Well, Sean Howe. Remember him? The American journalist who wrote Marvel Comics The Untold Story, the same guy who called the X-Men the most explicitly political comic of the 1960s? Well, he had this to say about Stan the Man himself. I think he was probably a good reflection of the average American, and how the average American was awakened by everything that happened in the 50s and 60s. I don't think of him as an activist in any sort, although now, 50 years on, I guess maybe even the most middle-of-the-road championing of justice seems more courageous. In other words, Stan Lee was less of an icon of the radical left and more of an enlightened centrist. On a side note, I also quite like the story behind the title X-Men. X-Men are called X-Men because Stan Lee's editor didn't like the mutants as a name, and Stan Lee thought the name X-Men sounded cool. He said, "No, Stan, that's no good, because our readers won't know what a mutant is." And I said, "You don't have enough respect for our readers. They will know or they'll learn by reading the story." He said, "No, I don't like the mutants." So I had to think of something else. So I thought for a while, each of them has an extra power. Maybe I'll call them the X-Men. That could be kind of dramatic, and that's why their leader, I called him Professor Xavier, cause it began with an X. Politics and social issues and themes, oh my, were the last things considered. Mere garnishes in Stan Lee's writer's room. And the real power behind these stories was truth. Not a half-truth or Stan Lee's version of the truth, but the truth. A universal truth, you could say. Just the world outside your window. As Neil Gaiman said, as a writer, you're not writing an autobiography. What you're doing is lying, but you're using the truth in order to make your lies convincing and true. You're using them as seasoning. You're using truth as a condiment to make an otherwise unconvincing narrative absolutely credible. So when Kelly Sue DeConnick is screeching about Marvel always having been political and how Captain America was a social justice warrior, she's rewriting reality, telling you the truth as she sees it rather than than the truth. Captain America was never a social justice warrior. He preferred classic blind justice, the flavor Stan Lee recommended, where evil was punished regardless of its background, and not social justice, which absolves you of evil based on how oppressed your ancestors were, or condemns you based on how oppressive your ancestors might have been. Marvel was in the business of heroes, not victims. Their battles were ultimately against evil and to defend the innocent, not to just categorically hate people like Magneto does. On that note, maybe DeConnick was half right. Superheroes may not be social justice warriors, but the SJW character archetype has always been present in Marvel Comics since Stan Lee's era. Hateful, angry, power-hungry psychopaths who categorically hate entire groups of people and seek constant validation for their supposed superiority and justification for their eternal rage. Well, this is Magneto, and pretty much every villain from the previous comic era fits this description in one way or another. So yes, social justice warriors have always been in Marvel Comics, as supervillains, not heroes, which probably explains why Marvel and DC's hero-loving reader base have chosen to abandon these modern stories in great numbers. In short, the X-Men have not always been social justice warriors, but they have always fought the tyranny of social justice, and they did so right from the first issue. Stan Lee and Claremont were both humble enough to know they weren't necessarily philosophers or gurus. They didn't use social issues to spread awareness, they used them to tell better stories. Even Alan Moore, the other writer activists love to point to, didn't worry about trendy topics or current events. Like Claremont and Lee, his focus was the craft. All my commercial success were never planned as such. They were all remote outliers that people liked. They liked them because they were well written, not because they were catching some trend. Nobody can advise about trends and the vagaries of public opinion. It is best, in my experience, to simply be a good writer. But perhaps the real reason why the myth became truth in the minds of so many was because in some way it was a bit true. Many have equated the X-Men to one outcast group or another, from sexuality to religion. But the X-Men are none of these, and they're all of these, because that's the true beauty of story. The X-Men aren't an allegory for any particular group. They're outsiders, and anyone who ever felt like an outsider themselves can not only connect to the X-Men's plight, but thanks to the philosophy of Stan Lee's Marvel, they can feel valued. Sure, this can mean an oppressed minority, but it can also just mean the nerd at school who has trouble making friends. The X-Men too are different from those around them, but they can still matter, and they can still be heroes. And lastly, if we must consider Stan Lee's soapbox segments and one truly cares about his perspective, why don't we consider this one? The Marvel Reader's Bill of Rights, written by Stan the Man himself. All Marvelites are created equal. Your bullpen will never favor one group of readers over another. Never favor one group of readers over another. We haven't even started yet, and already modern Marvel has failed. It wasn't made for you. Well, Stan Lee disagrees. Therefore, each and every one of you is irrevocably granted these inalienable rights. 1. The right to an unlimited variety of reading entertainment. 2. The right to carefully crafted stories that give you a fighting chance to understand what's going on when you plunk down your money. And get ready for this next one. 3. The right to comment about every Marvel tale you read, and to know that each of our editors values your opinion. So I'm pretty sure Stan Lee would actually be against calling his readers bigots for not liking his stories. 4. The right to buy only titles that interest you, and to shun any title that fails to entertain you. So again, Stan would be against the whole buy this or you're a bigot thing. 5. The right to fearlessly assemble in public to discuss Marvel's comics, characters, and creators. 6. The right to address all Marvel editors and creative people by their first names. 7. The right to be told what is currently happening in Marvel's mags, and what is being planned for the future. 8. The right to practice scripting and drawing on Marvel characters to your own pleasure and amusement. Now here's a good one. 9. The right to submit your best work to Marvel for consideration and know that the time and talent you have invested will be given the attention it deserves. And 10. The right to expect Marvel to always maintain a dedication to quality, a commitment to decency, and a sense of humor about everything we do. Tell me again how Stan Lee's wholesome Marvel is the same as the hateful Marvel of today. So be it. No mere words of mine can add to the glory and grandeur of those 10 immortal declarations. Those 10 pillars of wisdom which shall inspire the mighty world of Marvel now and evermore. Excelsior.